Okay, so this is the final instalment of the IGCSE Theory revision videos covering chapters 6, 7 and 8. Now there's a lot of content in these chapters, so if you feel that there's certain things that you want to look in greater detail, then you can always check back to our source website for ICT Lounge, or if you're looking for specific questions, please do send me an email. I've posted on Plato 3 of the last past papers along with their mark schemes if you're doing any checking through and practicing this evening. So let's start with chapter 6, which is applications. Now there are 16 different areas of this, so I'm not going to go through all of them. Many of them you'll be very confident with anyway, but let's just have a look through and just check what we understand of these. So in applications, the 6.1 communication applications, that can be anything from emails and instant messaging to software to produce flyers and posters or presentation software and things like that. Data handling applications. Data handling applications are your databases. Measurement applications, so we have systems using sensors to measure the external environment, things like the greenhouse example or weather stations and stuff like that. Microprocessors in control applications. So this is, we've talked about microprocessors in the home, but now microprocessors in control applications is when the microprocessor actually is reading something in the external environment and something happens. So the control means that you've got a motor or an engine to switch on the light or to close the door or to turn on the sprinklers, whatever else. That's all control applications. Modelling applications are spreadsheets, and you need to be prepared for the possibility that you can be asked to do some practical spreadsheeting in your theory assessment. So you could be presented with a spreadsheet whereby you have a problem to solve and you have to handwrite out what the correct formula would be for that. Applications in manufacturing industries, this is things like robotics, so a lot of crossover between what we did in chapter 1. School management systems, databases basically, looking at school management systems for creating new enrolment and timetabling and setting homeworks, things like our Plato system for communicating with students and so on and so forth, and taking registers of attendance. Booking systems. So we're going to look at online booking, real-time booking, etc. Banking applications, that comes up quite regularly, whether it be ATMs or the processing of checks and things. Computers in medicine, so maybe expert systems, or maybe things like 3D printing in medicine now for the production of things like hearing aids or specially designed prosthetics, implants for surgery designed by 3D printing. Computers in libraries, again, comes down to databases, a little bit of barcode scanning as well in there, because of course you'd have a system where you would be checking out books and checking in books and checking which of your members have the books and so on and so forth. Expert systems themselves. Computers in the retail industry, so this is our checkout system using the barcodes to control stock levels, where the stock control database automatically has a reorder point. Recognition systems, so this is things like OMR and OCR recognition, and also RFID chips and things. Monitoring and tracking systems, so this could be things like key logging, data logging, systems to listen into phone calls in offices and things, where you can monitor telephone calls between your client and an employee. And satellite systems, so GPS and how global positioning satellites are layered on top of maps to produce sat-navs and things like that. So I'm just going to summarise from a few of these elements. I'm not going to go into all of them in detail. If you think that there's something in there that you are unsure about, then you may need to do some separate reading this evening. So talking about booking systems, for example, we have 3 types of processing for booking systems: batch processing, online processing and real-time processing. The majority of our online booking systems will use online processing, because what online processing means is that it's a human being that enters the data, but that the data is updated at that moment in time. It is an immediate update of data. So when you enter your request for a particular room or a particular seat on an aeroplane, as soon as that payment is transferred, that seat becomes no longer available to other customers. Same for the room. It becomes no longer available to other customers. Batch processing is slightly different. It's what's used in checks. Batch processing would also be used for things like telephone bills and for things like looking at utility bills, electricity, etc. You don't receive a bill for every phone call that you make. At the end of the month, you receive one bill that collates all of your phone calls. So batch processing in that sense is where the company collects all of the data into batches and then deals with it at the end of the month or at the end of the day or at the end of the week. And then real-time processing is similar to online in that it happens instantaneously, but it doesn't require a human being to actually enter the requirements, because real-time processing uses sensors. So this would be the kind of thing that you would find in a climate-controlled greenhouse or in a weather station using sensors to process the data and have an output. So booking systems online tends to use online processing, and the benefit of that is that it's automatic and it's updated straight away. Okay, banking applications. Things that you need to be familiar with in banking applications is some of the terms. If they ask you to describe what EFT is, electronic funds transfer. This is the idea that banks can send money from one account to the other without actually ever transferring a physical cash. It's just a number is deleted from one account and added to the other account. So every time you do an electronic transfer, an electronic funds transfer, no money actually moves anywhere. It's simply the numbers from the accounts that move, and the bank accepts that the money that they have stored in their bank is only reflective of the value that's held on their accounts. You're quite often asked to talk about the clearing of bank checks, even though bank checks haven't been in use for such a long time in many countries. But like, for example, here in France, bank checks are actually quite popular. So we are still required to discuss it. Remember, bank checks use a combination of batch processing, as I was describing before, OCR to read the characters written on the bank check, the name, the address, the amount, and so on and so forth. MICR, which is the magnetic ink character recognition, checking that the data matches the account number and so on and so forth. And then looking from the data collected, the OCR and the MICR, checking that the data is correct and that it's within, that it's still valid, checking that the account details are there and that the account has the sufficient amount available, sufficient balance to be able to make the transfer and so on and so forth before the transfer occurs. It's batch processing because banks don't process every single check paid immediately. The bank will collect all of the checks for that day, for that week, and they will process them at the end of the day. So when you pay by check, actually the money doesn't straight away leave your account. There is a delay between paying by check and the money leaving your account. So for certain businesses and for certain industries, they don't accept payment by check anymore because it's not a guarantee that the money is actually there, that the money is actually available. If you're walking away with the product that you've purchased, then you may not be able to pay by check. It might be only one of those occurrences where you pay by check, and then once the check is cleared, then they send you your product. ATMs, which stand for automatic teller machines. Remember, not just used for withdrawals. You can check the balance, you can transfer money, you can top up your mobile phone, you can pay bills, you can do all kinds of things at an ATM. And the ATM has, again, processing that takes place. It compares the data on the chip with the secure PIN that the customer enters before it proceeds. And there's a whole series of processes that take place depending upon what you're asking for. If you're looking to withdraw money, it would then first ask you how much and then check that your balance is sufficient before the money is actually released. The first thing the ATM does is to check that you are who you say you are by comparing the PIN, and the ATM can withhold the card if the PIN is entered incorrectly more than 3 times for security measures. So these are our banking applications. Have a read over those notes, because banking applications do come up quite frequently in past papers. So expert systems. Expert systems are databases, massive databases basically, where experts have populated the database with their knowledge. And then the experts create a series of rules or questions. These are written by the experts. So, for example, a doctor might be writing a database to help diagnose skin conditions or something. And the question might be, does the patient have a skin rash or an irritation? A yes or no. And then depending upon that answer, the expert system would select the most relevant next question. It's not predetermined. So, for example, where is the rash? Is the rash itchy? Colouring of the rash, etc. Where it presents. These enable the user to access the expert's knowledge within the criteria of that knowledge. So within the expert knows what this rash is, but it's only that if these other symptoms are seen and are present in these ways. So each subsequent layer of questioning brings the user closer to the possible solution. The user answers questions which then compare the responses to the database. This is known as an inference engine. So it's a good keyword to use if you're asked to describe an expert system. Use the word inference engine as a description of the comparison between what the user enters and the database. And then at the end, the database will suggest possible problems or the possible solution based upon the data that has been made available. Expert systems, quite often medical, sometimes for more technical problems like tech solutions or car management for problems with engines and things like that. Sometimes IT problems as well, trying to find the root cause of a system failure and things. Okay, so these are expert systems. Recognition systems. So I've used the RFID recognition system here. The RFID stands for Radio Frequency Identification Device, and it's a little tag that gets put into your items for the purposes of tracking and recognizing the identification of your device. They're used for things like contactless payments, for electronic passports. They're also used for tracking pets. If you have a pet that has a chip, then they have a little RFID tag under the skin in the back of their neck, which will enable the vet, if they are lost, and if they're taken into a vet's or a pound, then the authorities will be able to scan that chip and identify your pet and get it returned to you. The chip itself is smaller than a grain of rice, and it contains a tiny circuit board and an aerial. So when it's scanned by the RFID scanner, it transmits the data. So like, for example, an identification data, an ID code or ID number, maybe an account number, to the RFID scanner, which then compares it for verification purposes. Okay, Chapter 7, System Life Cycle. System life cycle is broken down into 6 or sometimes called 7 steps. It really depends whether they've identified development and testing as one stage or 2 separate stages. Different textbooks show it in different ways, but these are the stages in order. So if it's 6, it's analysis, design, development and testing together, implementation, documentation, evaluation. Whereas if it's 7, you're looking for analysis, design, development, and then testing on the next line, implementation, documentation, evaluation. So let's just summarise those 6 or 7 steps. So analysis and design. The analysis phase is where the expert checks to see what the problem is with the current system. And they do that by asking questions, okay? They're looking to identify the customer specifications. What do they want the new system to do? So in this case, the customer is the business that's buying the new system. The analyst is providing this, and they want to find out what they want the new system to do, what specifications they want. So they do that by collecting data, either interviews, questionnaires, observations, or documents. So interviews are great because you can get lots of detailed responses and you can adapt your questions based upon the previous response, but it's very time consuming and you're not going to be able to interview everybody. Questionnaires help you to gather a much broader range of data, but that data is quite restrictive. You have to set the questionnaire ahead of time, so you can't adapt questions for different people depending upon their previous response. And people will, quite often sort of dismiss questionnaires. They won't give them the time necessary. So the data that we can collect in questionnaires is quite often closed data, so it doesn't go into detail and so on and so forth. Slight issues with that, but great if you've got a huge workforce and you want to collect data across a broad range of people. Observations are useful because the analyst can actually stand and watch what is happening with the current system and to see how the system is being used, because the user might not be aware of an error that they are making or the habits that they have with the current system, and it's only possibly by being observed by an expert that certain causes of problems might come to light. The disadvantage with this is that people do tend to behave differently than normal when being observed. And documents, this means collecting documentation from the current system. So having a look at the current data input form, the current table database, the current output form or output screen, its format, the size of the text boxes, the layout of the data types, all of those kind of things. The analyst can collect data using that. And then they go into the design phase. So the design phase is where the analyst actually designs the system. And so they will design various stages, including, and not exclusive to, but including things like data input forms or data input screens, the user interface, maybe it's a website, maybe it's a new piece of software, maybe it's an app. The data output screens or printed templates, what are the outputs going to look like? And the database tables themselves, so the fields and the records, the columns, what data types are going to go into each field, and to set up any validation rules that are going to be applied within that. Now, if you're not sure on validation rules, let's just clarify the difference between validation and verification and the different types. Validation is the process of checking that the data is appropriate and meets the requirements of the system. These are the typical validation rules: presence check, length check, range check, limit check, format check, data type check, and consistency check. I'm not going to read through all of them. You can read that yourself. If you're not familiar with a minimum of 2 of those, I would pause the video now and make a couple of notes on that. It's possible that you may need more than that, but usually when it comes to these kinds of questions, you're usually asked to give 2 examples or occasionally give 3 examples of a validation rule. Verification, however, is the process of actually checking that data is correct and has been entered correctly from the original source. So the ways to do this is a visual check, which is what we consider to be proofreading. But don't just write proofreading, because you need to be able to say it's proofreading by comparing to the original source. Okay, so that's what we call a visual check. The other way of doing it is double entry. By entering the data twice, we can compare to see if there's been any differences between the 2 entries. So these are the differences between validation and verification. Development and testing. So development is the actual build stage, where the analyst builds the tables in the database, builds the input forms, builds the output system. And they're going to use various controls for this, things like text boxes for the user to input data, or option buttons where the user will choose one or other choice, or check boxes where the user can select multiple options, or drop-down lists, or even command buttons where the user can save or submit their work. And then the testing phase is where the analyst creates a test plan and actually tests the system using normal, abnormal, and extreme data. Eventually, the system will also be tested using live data. So live data is real data from real users, and that's when the system actually gets rolled out. But at the testing phase, we tend to use extreme, abnormal, and normal data. So extreme data is data at the limits of the accepted range. So for example, if I was expecting data between 1 and 10, the numbers 1 or 10 would be extreme. It's at the limit of the range. Abnormal data would be data outside of that range, so 0 or 11 or the word 3, THREE, would be abnormal because it wouldn't meet the requirements of my range. And normal data is data within the normal accepted range, so 2 through to 9, all in numeric format. So let's have a look at a testing plan. A testing plan would have the following columns: what test it was, the data to be tested, okay, so what data is going to be entered, the type of test, is this normal data, is it extreme data, is it abnormal data, and then the expected outcome. And once the test has been carried out, you would have an actual outcome that would then state what really happened when that test occurred. And if the actual outcome was not the same as the expected outcome, then they need to step back into the development stage and check to see where the problem is. So this is an example where the cell should accept ages within the range of 17 to 70, and any other data should be rejected. So you can see the type of layout of this test plan. Okay, the implementation phase. There are 4 types of implementation: direct changeover, parallel running, pilot running, and phased implementation. Direct changeover is where you have system A one day, and then the next day you've got system B. You take away the old system and you bring in the new system. It's very good for a quick changeover. However, training needs can be quite intense for this, and you can come across quite a lot of problems, especially if it's quite a complex integral system to your business. Parallel running is where you actually run both systems at the same time for a period of time, and that might be for a week or for a month, but it gives you a backup in case something goes wrong with the new system. It's great if you've got companies that really can't afford to lose any data, like security businesses or banks and things like that, that really can't afford to make those kinds of mistakes. But it is very expensive because you're having to run 2 completely different systems at the same time, which might even mean 2 different sets of staff to be able to staff those systems. Pilot running is where you run the new system in just one department at a time. So you pilot it in a particular department. So the warehouse department is going to run the new system. Everybody else continues using the old system. And it means that that one department can check and see if there are any problems with the new system so that they can be corrected before it gets rolled out. But it can cause problems in communication between departments, because different departments will have different expectations, and then if they're very different systems, you might find that there are problems between departments. And then you've got phased implementations. This is where a business actually brings in this new system one part at a time. So we're going to use the new input forms, and then we're going to introduce the new database, and then we're going to introduce the new output forms. It doesn't always work, this, because it depends upon how compatible the old system is with the new system. Can you use the new system's input form with the old database? Do they actually correlate? But it can be good for organisations that really can't afford to lose data, but can afford the time of a slow changeover, because phased implementation is quite slow and drawn out. But these are the different implementation methods. Documentation and evaluation, the last phases of the system lifecycle. Documentation is the production of user guides and instruction manuals, and it's split into 2 categories. You've got technical documentation and user documentation. So technical documentation will be things like the specifications of the system, the coding of the system, file structures, verification and validation rules applied. It would include lists of the software required and the hardware needed for the system to run. And the technical documentation is all for the future developers of the system, future technicians who are going to manage or maintain it. Whereas the user documentation is much simpler. It's the how-to guides, it's the instructions, it's frequently asked questions, it's things like how to print, how to save files, how to log into the system. It might include video tutorials, it might include little screenshot diagrams of how to do certain things. And this is going to be used by the actual system users rather than by the technical experts. The last phase of the system lifecycle is evaluation. It's the process of getting feedback from various users of the system to see if the new system is actually meeting the needs that they originally identified in the analysis and design phase. The evaluation phase will often start the whole process again for many big companies who are constantly in a phase of system life cycle. They're constantly at one of those stages. You know, the whole stage might take 2 years. By the time you get round to the 2 years and you have your system working, you may only have a short period of time before you're actually going to go back into a new design phase, because technology moves so quickly and businesses need to move quickly as well, or they're going to lose out on opportunities against their rivals. So this is the system life cycle. Moving on to the last section then, which is safety and security. So Chapter 8, Safety and Security. First thing you need to be aware of is you need to separate out here safety and security, okay? Because sometimes people, students will mix up health and safety. Now, we talked about health in the impacts of ICT. We talked about repetitive strain injury and back and neck strain and eye strain. Those are health. Safety, okay, and security. Safety is the possible risk of injury due to an accident caused by computers. So things like trip wires, so where you've got wiring, having a drink next to your computer, the risk of spilling liquid onto electricity, the risk of storing large server boxes up on shelves and the fire hazards or things like that. So it's the possible implications of accidents associated to ICT as safety. I'm going to concentrate here on security, which is about security of data. It's about being safe online, e-safety, so securing your personal data, not talking to strangers, being careful about what information you share on social networks, and being careful about hackers and things like that. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on here. Just a brief explanation of the difference. So these elements here are everything that we should be trying to avoid in relation to security online, and this is some of the risks of sharing personal data and leaving yourself open to hackers. A hacker is anyone who can gain unauthorized access to your system. So we've got the risks of identity theft, theft of money, theft of stealing customer information, so this is if a business computer is hacked into, theft of email addresses and stealing email address information, and loss of important data. All of these are risks of operating online and of operating in an environment where perhaps you're not secure with your data. And you need to be aware of these because you may have to talk about the potential risks of using personal data online, and these are some of those. When we talk about security, we separate the methods or the ways of monitoring security into two ways. If it's for businesses, we can talk about things called digital certificates, which is a document attached to an email or a website that proves that the person who sent the email or the website is secure. And this is used to do things like prove licenses on software, or to prove that it is a message from the bank when they're asking you to log into your account and things. A digital certificate would consist of the sender's email address, the name of the sender, a serial number which can then be tracked to check the authenticity of the certificate, and the certificate's expiry date when it's valid from and to. When the recipient of the email opens it, they can view the digital certificate to make sure that it's come from a trusted source. So this is one method of checking regarding data security. Another method is by using a secure socket layer, an SSL, which is when we log on to websites that have the HTTPS code at the front. So HTTPS is, well, we've got Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and this is a Hypertext Transfer Protocol secure layer, okay? And what that means, the security layer means that the data transferred through these websites is encrypted, and it's called a secure socket layer, okay? So this means that when you use your bank or your credit card details online, like for e-commerce, for buying online, you can secure your information. You can trust that this website is doing everything possible to encrypt your data to prevent fraud, to prevent hackers from accessing your data. Now, it's not a guarantee. There have been big high-profile cases of companies that use secure socket layers and use HTTPS and have still had their customer information accessed and fraud occur. But it's one of the best ways to prevent this. So SSL encrypts the connection between your computer and the e-commerce website and ensures that those transactions are secure. It stops your bank or credit card details from being stolen. How can you tell if the website is secure? You want to look at its URL, and it should start with HTTPS, and there should be a little icon of a padlock in the bottom right hand corner. You should never make online purchases with websites that only start with HTTP. These sites are not encrypted. Okay, so this is just one example of security measures. You quite often have to think fairly commonsensical about this stuff. If they're talking about security e-safety, then they might be talking about, you know, how to protect children online, and it might be things like monitoring the websites that they go to, using parental controls, preventing them from being able to access certain chat rooms and things like that. It might be about educating them about not using personal data online, not sharing things like their school name or their address or their phone number onto websites where it can be picked up by people who might want to take advantage of that. So you have to think about the broader stuff. It's not just the technical responses when it comes to safety and security. It's a lot of it is the common sense approach to e-safety that you're talked to about constantly. So don't feel that it has to all be technical stuff. Quite often the simple answers in relation to safety and security: don't give out your password, change your password regularly. These are still worth marks because they're still real answers and they're still relevant today. Okay. Copyright. Copyright's the last section that I'm going to go through here. It comes under security. It actually comes under Chapter 9 audience, but we've done Chapter 9 audience as part of our practical stuff. So this is the last of the sort of theory things that come up. And the definition of copyright. So you've got copyright and copyright theft. Copyright theft is piracy. Okay. So this is when copyright is broken. Okay, so copyright theft is the downloading, copying, or borrowing of software without the permission of the owner, whereas copyright itself is the protection of software or the protection of electronic files to prevent downloading, copying, or borrowing without the permission of the owner. Okay. So an overview of software copyright is that it's very expensive. Very expensive to produce software copyrights, which is why so many companies and businesses and individuals will go through a huge amount of trouble trying to protect copyright. It's why you see governments like the French government cracking down on illegal downloading and streaming and file sharing online. It's because of the amount of cost that goes into actually developing these copyrights. Because software is digital, it is actually quite easy to download, but downloading a piece of software or a file or a movie or a game or a video or whatever else without the permission of the user, theoretically, in theory, is still stealing. And when you make copies of it without their permission, this is software piracy. And the reason you have to consider this is that those big game companies and the big music industries and the movie industries spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars and of man hours in producing their item, their device, their software, their music, their game. And then obviously their business is to recoup the costs of that research and development by selling the game. Well, if people can download the game or the music or the movie for free, then those businesses are going to go out of business. And this is where software copyright comes into play. So what do these laws cover? These laws are broadly stating that software cannot be copied, sold, or given away to other people. Software should not be used on a network of more users than you have paid for. This is an interesting one, because when you buy a personal license, usually that will cover you for around 5 devices. Now, for example, when the school buys a license for a piece of software, we have to cover ourselves for, 600-700 devices, because we've got students all the way from early years through to secondary, personal machines, school machines, teacher machines, all potentially using pieces of software. So you have to be very careful to ensure that your network doesn't have more users than what you've paid for. The law prevents you from renting out the software without permission. The law prevents you from stealing code from software and then using it in your own software. So, for example, going into the actual development code of a program like Microsoft Word and picking up the code and then making your own blag copy of Microsoft Word and selling it yourself. The code is part of what's protected, so you can't do that. And using the name of the copyright software on your product is also illegal. So passing off your product as Microsoft Word when it's not is also illegal. So the copyright not only protects the software, the code behind the software, the name of the software, and exactly the same for music, exactly the same for movies, exactly the same for gaming devices, etc. So this is copyright theft and the reasons behind it and what the law actually covers. If you've got any questions going through these 3 videos, please feel free to just send me an email. I'm available on email this evening. Have a look at the past papers that I've shared with you on Plato today as well. There's 3 different past papers I've shared, and each one has a mark scheme attached to it. It's very useful to go through with the mark schemes. Okay, best of luck, and let me know if you have any problems.